Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.
And they say that Shabbos Mevorach in Iyar, the Shabbos that they're Mevorach, the Kiddush of Iyar, Rav Moshe Feinstein was always a little bit sad. And the reason he was sad is because Chazal tell us, B'Nisan Nigalu, that the redemption will come in. We were redeemed in Nisan, U'B'Nisan Asidin Ligoyal, and the future redemption will take place in Nisan. Although Mashiach can come any time, but there is a concept that Nisan is the most likely month of the redemption. So as long as you're in the month of Nisan, there's such a good chance Mashiach will come. And when you're already moving towards Iyar, there's a bit of a downer, not only because you're leaving the Yom Tov of Pesach, but because the optimal Zman of Mashiach and Geula is you're leaving. So Rav Moshe was always a little bit sad, Shabbos Mevorach in Iyar, but the truth of the matter is, Iyar has many, many milas in and of itself. In the Sifrei Chasidus, it's brought down that the word Iyar is a Rashi Teva. It's an abbreviation for the pasuk in Parshas Beshalach. Ani, the Aleph is Ani, Yud Yud is Hashem. That's a short way of writing Hashem. And the Reish is Rofecha. I am Hashem who will heal you. And the notion of refuah is a very broad idea. We talk about, when we say Amisha Berach for Chaylim, we say refuas hanefesh or refuas haguf. So refuas haguf is if somebody is sick, they should be healed from their illness. Refuas hanefesh is a much deeper idea. It doesn't just refer to mental illness, but it refers to all of the distractions, all of the anxieties, all of the fears that people have that prevent them from doing what they can do to serve Hashem. So if Iyar is a month of refuas hanefesh and refuas haguf, that's a very, very great thing, that this month is mesugal for inner healing in all the different ways that you can do so. So Iyar too is a great, great month. In some ways, the relationship of Iyar to Nisan is very similar, actually, to the relationship of Cheshvan to Tishrei, right? Tishrei has all of the Yomim Tovim, and then comes Cheshvan with no Yomim Tovim at all. Iyar is not quite that, but Iyar is pretty close. What Yomim Tovim are in Iyar? So there are two Yomim, well, actually it depends. If you're a Zionist, there are four, and if you're not a Zionist, there are two. So the two, I will plead the Fifth Amendment regarding me. Okay, maybe later we'll talk about it. The two that are within the standard Jewish calendar are not really Yomim Tovim, but one is Pesach Sheni, the 14th of Iyar, is the opportunity of the second chance to make up the Korban Pesach. Now, we don't do very much on that day, but we don't say Tachanan, so at least we acknowledge it's a festive day. And the other one is Lag BaOmer, which is the day that the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. So those are what you would call the non-Zionist special days. And the Zionist special days are coming up this week. We have Yom HaZikaron, Tuesday. Monday night, Tuesday. I'm sorry, is it Monday night, Tuesday, or Tuesday night, Wednesday? What is it? Which one? Yeah. So the point is, that's actually a day which we memorialize the Chayalim that died in the defense of Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael. And then you have Yom HaTzmaut. I just want to point out, people raised the question, and we had Yom HaShoah, and it's a little controversial because Yom HaShoah was the memorial for the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews. And it's interesting that the Rabbanut got knocked for both Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut, because the idea is that you're not supposed to have sad days of commemoration in Nisan. So you shouldn't have Yom HaShoah in Nisan. And on the other hand, during Sfira, you're not supposed to play music, at least during certain periods. So you're making Yom HaTzmaut during Sfira, and you're making Yom HaShoah during Nisan, right? So both of them are a bit of a problem. But Yom HaZikaron is not for the Shoah. Yom HaZikaron is for the Chayalim, or anyone really, who died in Eretz Yisrael against terror and the like. Now, people sometimes ask, Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, they have the siren. Do you have to stand up and a moment of silence or 2 minutes of silence, whatever it is? So Yom HaShoah was already still Bein Hazmanim, so I don't know, so you didn't necessarily, I'm just curious what other Rebbeim do. I'll just say my own position. My own position is maybe an obvious position. That is, if you are in public, if you are in the street, you absolutely must stop and observe the moment of silence. And Yom HaZikaron is even more important than Yom HaShoah in that sense. And the reason that's so is Israel is a small country. So like any person you're looking at may have lost a son, or lost a parent, or lost a brother, or lost a sister. Right? It's not so hard to find somebody who lost someone. And for a Ben Torah in particular, to kind of treat that with indifference and not to commiserate with the suffering of people is very callous, and it is an awesome Chilul Hashem. So there are some from people who say, oh, this is a Geisha thing about moments of silence, I don't keep these things. If you are outside, 1,000%, you must. Inside, okay, listen, it's not Taryag mitzvos, so you're not mechuyev to get up, so that already, and especially if you're learning, it would be a shikol b'dul Torah. So I wouldn't call it a chiyuv, but legabe other people, you do have to, cannot be poresh min hatzibor. Regarding, actually I want to make one comment about Yom HaShoah and one about Yom HaZikaron. Both of them have some interesting ideas. With Yom HaZikaron, so they tell the story about Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I think I've mentioned the story before, and maybe you've heard it anyway, where Rav Shlomo Zalman was the Rosh Yeshiva of Kol Torah, which is in Bayit V'Gan. It's still in Bayit V'Gan. In fact, how he became Rosh Yeshiva was a very, very interesting story. He was a young man. This I think goes back to the 30s. I think this goes back to before there was a state of Israel. And he was in Kailol, he was learning, he was steiging. But at some point, the family was growing. You had to make a parnasa. So he applied to be a Magid Shir in Yeshivas Kol Torah. So the process when you apply to be a Magid Shir in a yeshiva, maybe some of you will one day go through this, is you have to give a shir, right? And you're evaluated. It's a little nerve-wracking. I mean, actually, Or Sameach didn't do that, so I can't say that I did that here. But if it's Yeshiva Gedol, if you go to Mir or whatever it would be, they actually make you give a share. But not to the Talmidim. You give a share to the Rosh Yeshiva. And they kind of go through whether you know what you're talking about or whatever. So Shlomo Zalman gave a shir. He was like 25. He gave a shir in front of the senior Rosh Yeshiva of Kol Torah. And in the middle of the shir, one of the Rosh Yeshiva asked him a kasha. And Rav Shlomo Zalman thought for a minute, and Rav Shlomo Zalman said, you're right, your kasha is so good, my whole shir is wrong, I'm just going to stop here because you slugged up my whole shir. And he went home. He lived in Shari Chesed, adjacent to Rechavia. So he took the long bus home. Remember, and I assume Eged was slower than it is, this goes back to the 30s, really long time ago. And he told his Rebbitzin, he says, I messed up. Imagine, for Shlomo Zalman, I messed up. Listen, obviously they're not going to hire me. I prepared a whole shir, and they slugged it up, and I couldn't answer it, and that's it. So we'll have to look for some other parnasa. So like an hour later, nobody had phones in those days. The only phone was in the post office. So somebody rushes and says, there's a phone call for you in the post office. You got to go right now. So he goes to get the phone. And it was the Hanhala of Yeshivas Kol Torah that offered him a job. They offered him the position. So he said, Baruch Hashem, I'm very, very grateful, but I messed up. Why are you offering me the position? Everything I wanted to say, you slugged up. So they said, listen, we know that a Talmud Chacham like you could have finagled his way out of any question. You could have said something. But you also had a sense it wouldn't have been emes. You could have maybe fooled us, whatever, but it wouldn't have been emes. And you were maida ala emes. That's exactly the type of Rebbe we want for our Talmidim, a Rebbe that is maida ala emes. And therefore he was hired precisely because he was willing to say, my shir is wrong. every Rebbe, every Mechadesh has a certain investment in their Torah, right? So if I have a Kiddush, if you have a Kiddush, you want to defend it. So you'll come up with, this answer, that answer, even though it's not so solid. But a person whose commitment is not to the proprietary nature of their Chiddushim, but he's looking for emes. So if you could, if he's convinced that it's not emes, he'll be choser. The Gemara has, Rava says a few times in Shas. Rava said a halacha publicly, and Rava said, after thinking about it, after someone else asked him a question, he assembled all of his Talmidim and he said, Devarim shamarti aleichem tos hein biyadi. That which I told you yesterday is a mistake. Maida ala emes. Great Maida. Okay, so that was a digression. But the reason I brought up Rav Shlomo Zalman with respect to Yom HaZikaron, that's why I brought him up, is that there is a famous story, and it comes in two versions, so I don't want to say for sure which is the authentic version, that one of his Talmidim said he was going up to Tzfat to daven by the graves of tzaddikim. Now in Tzfat, I'm sure you've all been there, you have the Arizal, you have Rav Yosef Karo, you have the Alshich, the greatest tzaddikim, and then right next to Tzfat you have Meron, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. By the way, it's kedai to go to Meron in the off-season. Lag BaOmer, it's very, very hard to get near the kever. But you go, if you went to Meron today, you'd have the whole kever for yourself. It would be a good time to go. They say that Meron is so crowded, I mean, putting aside the tragedies that happened, which we still think about, but even putting that aside, they say Meron is so crowded on Lag BaOmer that even Rav Shimon Bar Yochai goes somewhere else. Like he kind of leaves to go. But anyway, Meron and Tzfat are right next to each other. So the Talmud wanted to go to Kivrei Tzadikim. So Rav Shlomo Zalman said, why do you have to schlep to Tzfat to daven by the grave of a tzaddik? Whenever I want to daven by the grave of a tzaddik, I go to the military cemetery at Mount Herzl, which is right next to Bayit Vagan, right? Last stop on the light rail is the military cemetery, Har Herzl. And I daven by the kever of a chayal who gave his life in defense of Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael. And such a person is worthy of having our prayers answered in his merit. That person is a tzaddik. Now, there are two versions, because according to one version, he said, even if the chayal is not from, even if the chayal is not observant. According to others, he said a chayal that is shomer mitzvos. Okay, but there are two girsos of how far he went. But this is a very, very important thing to think about, because as you know, the religious world right now, for a while already, has been embroiled in a great deal of controversy concerning the army, right? The different government proposals to have a compulsory draft of yeshiva, Bachram, etc. And the Haredi yeshiva world is very, very much opposed to it because we need full-time learning in the Beis Medrash, and also the environment in the army can be corrupting. So even if a Haredi person is not even in yeshiva, even if they're working, but there's a fear. You schlep them into the army, even though there are Nachal Haredi, but still, unfortunately, it's often the case, or at least sometimes the case, that people go off the derech. So, sometimes, I'm not going to say all the time. So there's a lot of opposition to the notion of forcing people into the army, but the problem is that should not obscure hakaras hatov to the people who are in the army. The problem is people confuse it. In other words, they say, I'm against, being forced to go into the army, therefore I'll spit on a soldier or whatever it is. One has nothing to do with the other. I could say, I do not think B'nai Torah should be taken out of the Beis Medrash for any reason whatsoever. Okay? I could say that. But I could also say at the same time, I am makir tov to those who are making great sacrifices for Eretz Yisrael. So it's very important not to allow our disagreement. First of all, it's not even a disagreement with the army, it's a disagreement with the government that wants to push this. It's very, very important to separate in your mind the hakaras hatov that you have for chayalim, which is an important thing to have, versus whatever your shita is, legabe military service and the like. In fact, it's either of Gershon Edelstein, I should be well, or of Michael Lefkowitz, one of the Rosh Yeshivas in Panovich, was giving a shmooze to the Panovich, Bachman and Panovich, in which he talked about Hakaras HaTov to the Chayalim. I saw this, it was on YouTube a little bit. So the one who was recording the video then panned to the crowd, as of Gershon Edelstein or of Michael Yehuda, said, you have to have Hakaras HaTov to the Chayalim. So the guys, like, their mouths were open. Oh, what's going on? They didn't understand what was being said, like they were in the Twilight Zone or something. But he said it, and before him, years and years ago, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz in Mir used to say it a lot. So Hakaras HaTov is a very, very, very big yesod, whatever your position is regarding military service, and you have to remember that. Someone, and Rav Shlomo Zalman said, such a person, certainly if he's a Shomer Mitzvahs, and maybe even if he's not, those are the two girsais, is considered to be a righteous person, because he gave his life for Am Yisrael and for Eretz Yisrael and the like. So that's so Yom HaZikaron does have a certain importance. And when I said before that if you're privately you don't have to stand up, that's not because I was demeaning the importance. I was just saying particular rituals are not chiyuvim, meaning this is a secular ritual. So when you're in public, keep it, but you're not mechuyev to keep it, but you should think. For example, I'm learning in the zechus of the people who gave their lives, and that's something to think about. Now, let me go backwards a little bit, although I'm digressing. Let me go backwards a little bit and talk about Yom HaShoah, right? So I said Yom HaShoah is a big problem because Yom HaShoah is the end of Nisan, and Nisan you don't have sad days. So why did they pick the 28th of Nisan to be the memorial day for the Holocaust? Like, what happened? So the answer is something did happen on the 28th of Nisan, the corresponding English day, and that was the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto. Right? The Warsaw Ghetto was one of the few times in which there was organized Jewish armed resistance against the Nazis. And although the ghetto was ultimately destroyed, but nevertheless we stood up and we fought, and therefore we memorialize the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were kama v'kama gedolim who encouraged us, meaning this is not simply an example of like non-religious people fighting. Rav Nachum Zemba, although he was a businessman, he actually was one of the Gedolei Hador, a tremendous, tremendous guy, and died in the Warsaw Ghetto, etc. And he said it was a Kiddush Hashem to stand up. But the question would be this: 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. The Warsaw Ghetto was a particular event in the Holocaust. Why did the Israeli government choose the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto to commemorate the Shoah? I mean, there are many things that could have been chosen. So the answer is everything in Israel has a political history. And this political history was actually quite painful if you go back to the founding of the state. And that was the following. The original Zionist founding fathers and one founding mother, Golda Meir, but basically it was mainly male Ashkenazim, had a certain disdain towards the origin that they came from. I mean, these were mainly Jews that came from Poland, Russia, which is Ashkenazi, right? Ben Gurion was David Green, etc. And they had a certain disdain because they looked at the Gullus Jew as passive, ineffectual, weak, not standing up for their rights. And in the state of Israel, from a secular Zionist perspective, we were going to be strong, we were going to be tough, we were going to beat anybody up who tries to hurt us in any way, right? The never again motto. So that actually created, in the early years of the state, a certain discomfort with the way 6 million Jews were killed. There were statements that were said, they went like sheep to the slaughter. Why didn't they fight? Why didn't they stand up? Now, of course, even a few moments of reflection would show you how utterly helpless and hopeless most of the millions of Jews were. No way of doing anything. But still, they were looked down upon. So when we have to again, I'm speaking from a secular perspective here. So when we have to memorialize the Holocaust, we don't want to memorialize the Jews that went like sheep to the slaughter. We don't admire those Jews. So we got to look around a little bit for the Jews that were tough and the Jews who fought and the Jews that even though they wound up dead, but they didn't go without a fight. So as a result, the Warsaw Ghetto became the paradigm for what we admire and what we want to remember about Jewish heroism, rather than what you might call the passive deaths of the people who went like sheep. Now you should know, people don't think about this today, but in the early years of the state, when there were many, many, many Holocaust survivors who were still alive, right? The World War II was over 1945, and the State of Israel is 1948, so there were many, many Holocaust survivors alive. People were very hurt. They felt that they were being delegitimated, that there was no compassion for them, there was no feeling for them. So there was a lot of controversy. Should the Warsaw Ghetto be the day that you memorialize Holocaust? Now, the truth of the matter is, this is a false dichotomy. It's not an either or, meaning we're machshev the Kedoshim who went because they had no ability to fight, and we're machshev those who fought. It's not a question of delegitimating, but the question is, where was the emphasis? So everything in Israel, even Yom HaShoah, becomes a controversy in which there were different sensibilities that were affected. So I think I had mentioned, forgive me for repeating, that you actually find a very similar dichotomy all the way back to the Hanukkah story, which was the revolt of the Maccabees against Greek oppression. Now, the story of Hanukkah is told in the Gemara very, very briefly. Not a long story at all, but the main sources for all of the details of the story of Hanukkah, and many, many years. Remember, the war of the Maccabim against the Greeks was a 25-year struggle. It wasn't just a quick little thing. So we have two books. They're called Sefer HaMaccabim, the Book of the Maccabees. And although there are 4 books of the Maccabees, so-called, some even have 7, but the history of the Hanukkah period is only told in Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. And there's a lot of overlap because they're covering the same time period and they cover the same history, all the different wars and the Hanukkah miracle and everything else. Maccabees 1 is the earlier book, and that was probably written almost right after the military victories. Maccabim 2 may have been written 100 years later. But what's interesting is, although both of them are telling the same history, there is a difference in focus between Maccabim Aleph and Maccabim Beis. Both books are religious. They are not secular books. Both books talk about Hashem and prayer to Hashem, right? So it's not a religious secular divide. But what is it that they want to glorify? What is it that they want to commemorate? In Maccabim 1, the thing that's being commemorated is military success. All the different stories of Yehuda HaMaccabee and the armies, right? In fact, it gives you much more information that you probably would be interested in. It goes over every military campaign, every hill, every town, every village. In fact, I was told that during the Vietnam War, Maccabees 1 was a required text for guerrilla warfare, because what was the situation of Vietnam? Vietnam, you probably don't remember, or you weren't even born in Vietnam. I will say that Vietnam did wonders for the growth of Torah in America. That's an inside joke. I'm not sure if you'll get it. There was a draft during Vietnam. And one of the ways you got exempt from the draft was if you were in a yeshiva or a seminary. So as a result, the enrollment of yeshivas greatly expanded during the Vietnam War. So I guess that was a silver lining, so to speak. But Vietnam involved the most powerful army in the world, the United States, fighting against a bunch of rice farmers with funny hats in Vietnam. So you'd think there's no contest. The United States Army versus rice farmers? But who won? The truth is, okay, technically we never said we lost, but Lamaisa we lost. These rice farmers got rid of us. So where was there a precedent in terms of military history? The Maccabees were guerrilla warriors fighting the most powerful army in the world. Now, as religious Yidden, we believe it was Hashgacha Pratis, it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if you're just looking at this from a military perspective, you'll want to study the book of Maccabees to understand how guerrilla warfare could defeat even the most powerful army. So as far as I understand, during the 60s and 70s, the book of Maccabees was a required book in West Point and the other military academies. So the book of Maccabees, one, emphasizes military victory. We fought back and defeated the most powerful army in the world. Maccabees, too, talks about martyrdom, right? Stories like Hannah and her 7 sons who were killed, al Kiddush Hashem. So, Lanias Daiti, this is mamish the parallel with Yom HaShoah, meaning are you going to glorify like the Warsaw Ghetto, or do you glorify the people who died al Kiddush Hashem? Right? Interesting. So apparently the reason why 2 books were written is because there were 2 different dayas, which is the thing that you should emphasize. So the historical issue repeats itself again. Now, this gives rise to another issue, and that is, we commonly say, that people who die in the Holocaust, died al Kiddush Hashem. We always say that. They died al Kiddush Hashem. The question is, what does that actually mean? The classic example of Kiddush Hashem is that the guy goes over to you and says, convert to, like the Crusades or the Inquisition, convert to Christianity or I will kill you. And you make a statement that says, I will die before I renounce my faith in Hashem and His Torah. And a person dies. That's Kiddush Hashem, because you had the choice to kind of accept that other religion and reject the Torah, and you did not reject the Torah because you're proclaiming God as your ultimate master. That's Kiddush Hashem, which means Kiddush Hashem presupposes the element of choice. You had an escape route that you could have taken, and you didn't take it. That's called Kiddush Hashem. Now, Crusades, Kiddush Hashem, Inquisition, Kiddush Hashem, various Islamic persecutions, Kiddush Hashem. The problem with the Holocaust is this. The problem with the Holocaust is there was no choice. Even if a Jew converted to Christianity, which some Jews did anyway, they would still go to a concentration camp. Converting to Christianity didn't help you. You're still a Jew, right? Hitler followed the halakha here. You're a Jew, even if you convert. In fact, there was one woman, she became a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, Edith Stein, a Jewish woman, Litzarenu, before World War II. She converted to Catholicism. She became a Carmelite nun, and when Hitler started the concentration camps, she was shipped to Auschwitz, and she died as a Jew in Auschwitz. 20 or so years later, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint because they called her a martyr to her faith. Now, that's very absurd. How can you be a martyr to your faith? She didn't die because she was a Catholic. She died because she was a Jew. So she didn't give her life because of her faith. So the big kasha is, and it's a painful kasha, we don't necessarily, again, you have to be sensitive, but just in terms of understanding, why would it be the case that those who died in the Holocaust are considered to be dying al Kiddush Hashem? Number one, they didn't have a choice. And number two, many of them were not even religious, and some of them did not even practice, did not even consider themselves Jewish, although the Maisa they were Jewish. Of course, keep in mind too, another prat, that fact, I don't know, this is an interesting question. Under Hitler's definition of a Jew, some people may not have been halakhically Jewish. If you had like one grandparent that was Jewish, so he didn't go with matrilineal descent. So that's an interesting question. I've never explored this. How many of the 6 million, I'm not sure if it was a large number, but how many of the 6 million were not even halakhically Jewish? Simply because under the Nuremberg definition of Jew, some of them might have been non-Jewish. I don't know. Again, I don't think it was a large number, but there were some in there that were not halakhically Jewish. So the question is, the statement that we always make, that if you died in the Holocaust, if someone died in the Holocaust, they died al Kiddush Hashem, how could that be so? There was no choice. Doesn't Kiddush Hashem require a choice? So Rav Dessler has a beautiful, beautiful essay in the Michtav Me'Eliyahu. Very, very beautiful essay. I mean, it's beautiful because it comes out of his heart. Remember, Rav Dessler, just a little history. Rav Dessler came from Kelm, the famous Rav Simcha Zissel of Kelm established. He was the greatest Talmud of Rav Yisrael Salanter, and he established the Musar Yeshiva in Kelm. And Rav Dessler's parents and Rav Dessler's uncles, they all were in Kelm. And Rav Dessler grew up in Kelm. Kelm is a city on the German-Lithuanian border. I think it's in Lithuania, but near the German border. And Rav Dessler had already gone to England. Remember, Rav Dessler spent many years in England before he came to Eretz Yisrael. So Rav Dessler was already in England before World War II, so he escaped the Holocaust. I mean, England was bombed, but he was, in England. But his whole family, his parents, siblings, everybody, was wiped out in Kelm. Kelm was totally massacred. And there were very, very few survivors. But Rav Dessler had one person who escaped from Kelm and was able to describe to him as an eyewitness how the tzaddikim of Kelm went to their deaths. And the head of the yeshiva in Kelm was called the Talmud Torah, even though it was a yeshiva, it was called the Talmud Torah of Kelm. And the head of the Talmud Torah was, the Rosh Yeshiva was Rav Daniel Mavshevitz. And he described that Kelm, the thing about Kelm was they always cultivated what you might call an inner sense of calmness. This is one of the Alter of Kelm's most important teachings. Never get nervous, never get upset. Take your time. Think about things before you act. Don't get agitated. And even though the Nazis are about to gun them down, machine gun them down, Rav Moshevitz went to the Nazi guy and said, "Can you give us a few minutes to prepare for this?" And for whatever reason, the Nazi guy said, "Okay, you have a few minutes." And he spoke to his Talmidim that Hashem has made us a korban for Am Yisrael. We have to prepare ourselves. We lived our whole lives to serve Hashem. And now we have to serve Hashem in the moment of our deaths. And we have to be calm. And we have to focus. And we shouldn't get upset. We shouldn't get agitated. Now, the eyewitness told Rav Dessler, this is quite amazing. The Nazis had literally never seen this. Usually when people are about to be killed, they start screaming, they start crying, they start begging for mercy, although mercy is never forthcoming. But they beg for mercy. And here were people who knew they were going to die. But there was calmness, there was serenity. They said Shema, they did Vidoy. Everything with Yishuv Hadas. So this is the part that always gets me. He says, the Nazis themselves were stunned. They couldn't believe that these were human beings. They were like angels. And the Nazi guy who was supposed to shoot them all said to the superior officer, maybe we should just let these people go. They were afraid of them. They saw the Shekhinah, they saw Kedusha. They were afraid to kill them. But their Yetzer Ra was miskaber over the Yetzer Tov, and of course they did kill them. So Rav Dessler said, when he described all of this, he said, Kiddush Hashem can take different forms. There is the Kiddush Hashem when you had a choice, and you took the choice of serving God rather than rejecting Hashem. That's Kiddush Hashem. But then there's another type of Kiddush Hashem when you don't have a choice, but how you choose. Well, a different type of choice. It's not the choice that would have gotten me out of the situation, but it's the choice of how you face death. To face death with emunah, with bitachon, with trust in Hashem, concentrating and focusing on how to glorify Hashem in your moment of death. So Dessler said, that's also a Kiddush Hashem. You see, it's not the Kiddush Hashem, I could have saved my life by. Yeah, they didn't have that option. But a Kiddush Hashem that even the Nazis saw. Can you imagine? The Nazi said, literally was afraid to kill them. Was afraid. Because they mamish saw or felt the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that group. So that's Rav Dessler's mahalach of Kiddush Hashem. But the truth of the matter is, as beautiful and moving as this is, it's still not a complete teretz. Okay, that for emperors like people like Kelm, the Tzaddik of Kelm. But what about people who didn't go to their deaths that way? And what about people who did not believe in the Torah? In other words, this is not a teretz for every single case. This is a teretz for some cases. So here we get into more of an interesting controversy. There is a passage in the Rambam that's often quoted, although it's actually, the Rambam doesn't quite say it. That's the problem. I mean, people want to fetch the Rambam to mean that anybody who dies because they're Jewish, if you are killed because you are a Jew, even if you don't observe Judaism, that is called death al Kiddush Hashem, because you died as a representative of God's people. So, if somebody gets killed in an automobile accident, and they happen to be Jewish, that's not called Kiddush Hashem. They didn't die because they're Jewish. But if they were singled out because they're Jewish, and this would also apply to victims of terrorism, same thing, right? During Pesach, right before the last day of Pesach, we had a great, great tragedy in Efrat of, two girls and their mother, or two young women and their mother were killed in a terrorist attack. By the way, the way the family responded is also a Kiddush Hashem. Actually, the father had been a Rav in England, Rabbi D. And the story, not a story, I mean, we know this. He came to Shoah after burying his two daughters. His wife was still in a coma. She died the next day. But after burying two daughters, he came to Shoah on Shvi Shel Pesach, and they were reciting Hallel, and the Chazan didn't want to sing it. I mean, the mood was so sad. The Chazan was just going to say Hallel. And Rabbi D went over to the Chazan and said, "It's Yom Tov. Could you please sing Hallel? We have to rejoice in Hashem's Yom Tov." Imagine the Madrega. So that, I think, is also an example. Yeah, the young women didn't have a choice. But the response is a Kiddush Hashem. And then, of course, we have the Rambam statement that because they were singled out as Jews, that gufa is called Kiddush Hashem, right? So this is kind of the reasons why we say that those who give their lives, I mean, not even give their lives, those who are killed, they didn't even give their lives, so to speak, because they're Jewish, there is an union of Kiddush Hashem in their deaths, and that's why we commonly say that the Jews who were killed in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, were al Kiddush Hashem. It's interesting, just as an aside, the word Shoah. Now, Shoah is a biblical term. It means massive destruction. It appears in Tehillim and the like. Shoah. But Shoah as applied to the Holocaust is relatively new. I think they began using it in the 60s and the 70s. They applied the term Shoah to the Holocaust. The great Rav Hutner was against. Rav Hutner always had some interesting Kiddush here. By the way, Rav Hutner's daughter, Rebbetzin David, was just nifter. Brilliant woman in her own right. You know, Mishpacha magazine, because they don't run pictures of women, but they had to write an article on Rebbetzin David. She was like a tremendous mechaneches for half a century. So they put a big picture of Rav Hutner, her father, who died 40 years ago, on the magazine cover. So you walk by Mishpacha magazine, you see a big picture of Rav Hutner. Gee, I thought he died in 1970. Yeah, he did. But his daughter died now, and they can't run a picture of the daughter, so they had to put a nice picture of Rav Hutner. But Rav Hutner was against the word Shoah, because this is what Rav Hutner said. Shoah implies singularity. This is an unparalleled event that never happened before. And Rav Hutner said, from the perspective of Torah Judaism, the Tochacha itself talks about God concealing his face, etc. And you have to look at this as part of a pattern of Jewish history, of Hester Panim and Golus and Churban. And he was against the idea of looking at this as an absolutely unique. In fact, this actually explains why many in the Torah world are not even in favor of a special Yom HaShoah. In fact, the Brisker Rav was, besides the Warsaw Ghetto issue, which is one issue I mentioned before, but they said, we memorialize Jewish tragedies on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the day of national mourning for all of the calamities of the Jewish people. So on Tisha B'Av, we recite kinos, or in some places about the Holocaust and other tragedies and the like, and you don't make a special day singling out one tragedy over other tragedies. So Rav Hutner didn't even like the word Shoah because that was singling out the Holocaust as an absolutely unique event. Okay, so we'll see you tomorrow, and take care.